There was a show on Netflix that's still on. It's called Hell on Wheels. It's about the great race to build the railway across the country after the Civil War. It's kind of brutal, probably not for kids, but it shows pretty realistically in some ways the great sacrifices and the politics and everything that went with that endeavor. A couple of train companies, railroad companies, were competing with each other to get across the country first. What intrigued me was, in relation to this gospel, is when they came upon a great chasm, how to build the tracks across. I found it amazing. I still find it amazing how we can do that. The engineering feat it takes, the energy, the time, the dedication. But it gets done. The chasm is crossed and the railroad continues. I'm also struck by the Aesop's fable about the goose that laid the golden egg, right? The golden egg, and then somebody wanted more, so they said there's got to be more inside the goose, and so they killed the goose and opened it up, and there was nothing. They weren't satisfied with getting a golden egg every once in a while. They wanted more. I think about the native tribes that welcomed Columbus and those who came with open arms and then were later enslaved by some of the people then, and also other native tribes. They were the ones like Lazarus who was kind of kicked to the side and forgotten and ignored. And they still are. I don't know how many news agencies are covering the North Dakota pipeline that the natives are trying to get stopped because of possible and probable, maybe, leakages in oil into their water supplies and in the reservation and digging up their sacred land and all this kind of thing. In a way, they are the Lazaruses of our time, the ones forgotten. We go to Pine Ridge and they say, what do you do there? Well, we listen to stories mainly. We have people that have been great-great-grandsons of Wounded Knee and some others. And they tell their stories. And what's important is no one listens. So it's important to have someone to listen to their stories, because no one ever does. It's getting better in some ways it's not. The modern-day Lazarus is alive and well. And the modern rich person is alive and well too. And I can't say that we're Lazarus, because sometimes we are, and more often than not, we might be the rich man. You know, even King David was caught in the trap. There is a time when, you know the story of Bathsheba, you know, that he took this holy man's wife, and David had several wives. And yet he took Bathsheba and sent her husband on the front line to be killed so that he could have Bathsheba. And his buddy, his prophet, his confidant Nathan was telling him a story. He said, David, there's in your land, there's a guy who has like one sheep. And then a rich guy comes and takes his one sheep. What do you think of that? And David gets enraged and said, that guy should just be punished, and he should be drilled, and he should just be... And Nathan said, you're that man. It's a shock to the system. It's a revelation of truth that we don't want to see. We are the Lazaruses. We are the rich man. The chasm described here, some commentators say that's not so much in the afterlife as maybe this life. The chasms that we create or that we won't want to cross. And there's stories saying Pioneer is that great chasm. Don't go past South Pioneer Road, because then you get into Milwaukee, and there are all sorts of troublemakers there. Right? It's scary. Let's do some ministry with our sister congregation, All Peoples. That's not the best of neighborhoods, but it's not the worst either. But to cross the chasm and form relationships is tough to do. Sometimes I know it's just easier to write a check or send some quilts along, whatever, and just kind of keep at a distance rather than actually being there and talking and being in a relationship with someone else who's maybe a lot different than we are economically or culturally or however that may be. The chasm is there. And Jesus is telling us in this parable that it's not too late, right? We have the law, the prophets, we've got the Moses, we've got several people in Scripture who have shown us the way. We have Jesus Christ himself, who really shows us the way and breaks down the boundaries and gets punished for it severely on a cross. to bridge some chasms that they did not want to see or be a part of or cross themselves. But the way is shown, and there are people who have been crossing the chasm and building bridges for a long, long time. The rich man, of course, treats Lazarus as a servant, as a slave once again, even in the afterlife. Yeah, go tell Lazarus to dip his finger and serve me some more, even in his afterlife. It's not enough that he had to be ignored in his present life, but in the afterlife he also gets ignored and gets turned into servanthood. And like me, like a lot of people would say, well, this rich man, he should suffer for a while. Yeah, it's good for his soul to suffer for a while. Then maybe he will have some empathy for others. And maybe that's what sometimes is necessary for us to really see the other side and how the other half lives, is if we have some suffering in our lives so we can understand. Not to say that's a good thing to want to suffer, but if it happens, sometimes we have a better appreciation. You know, those of us who grew up in an age where we didn't have much money in the family, and you might be there now. So little things were really important. You get one gift at Christmas time, or your father has to look for coal on the railroad tracks for the fire, for the house, for the stove. We all heard stories. We've lived those stories of appreciation because, in a way, we're brought low like a Lazarus. We know what it's like to scrape. And sometimes when we get to a point where we're more well off and it becomes comfortable to just do our own thing and not worry about anybody else. And, when I preach, I say the same thing to myself. So I'm not pointing fingers except maybe at myself too. The chasm. Bridging the chasm by relationship. And that's what Jesus, I think, was all about. Is forming relationships with anybody and everybody. It didn't matter if they were Jew or not. And we have the gospel writer of Luke, who was the only Gentile of the gospel writers, the outsider of the Jews, writing about the outsiders, and for women and justice and the outsider, and this Lazarus who need to be brought back into the fold. He makes a point of saying we may know the law, and sometimes even the resurrection of Jesus doesn't make a difference to us. Sometimes. I say overall, it's deep in our hearts that it does make a difference, and the big difference in our lives. Knowing that this Christ has suffered for us and with us to show us a different way, to bring the chasm together, to bridge the chasm, to show hospitality to anybody and everybody, even though it's hard. There are very difficult things. Sharing our wealth. Not only money, but ourselves, our time, our relationships with others. The question that remains in our society and even here today is how can our church, we as people of God, not only in this building but other buildings as well, how can we serve as a bridge that crosses the great chasm? The chasms that we can finally see and be made aware of. It separates the haves from have-nots. How can we be that bridge? Amen.